Hello, everyone, and welcome to day one of UCP's 2024 Conference on Latinos with Disabilities. I'm Armando Contreras, President and CEO of United Cerebral Palsy. Thank you for joining us as we kick off this three-day event dedicated to advancing discussions, understandings, and solutions for Latinos with disabilities. For those unfamiliar with United Cerebral Palsy, we are a network of 55 affiliates across the US and Canada, providing life-saving and vital services to over 150,000 children and adults with disabilities annually. Via our affiliate network, our mission is to be an indispensable resource for individuals with cerebral palsy and other disabilities, ensuring they live inclusive, fulfilling lives with their families and communities. While cerebral palsy is the most common motor disability among children, about 2/3 of those served by our affiliates have other disabilities. This broad scope of services highlights our work, diverse and vital nature. To learn more about UCP, our 75th anniversary, or our United for Gold campaign, please visit our website at ucp.org. That's ucp.org. You can also sign up for our quarterly newsletter, Life Without Limits, and find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, and other social media platforms. Today's virtual conference is unique. While local and academically oriented events touch on similar topics, this national event aims to reach a wide and diverse audience, especially within the Latino disability community. With about 8 million Latinos in the United States having a disability, our goal is to provide a platform for meaningful discussion, presentations, and hopefully future training. We will address issues relevant to the general disability community, but through the distinct lens of cultural, social, and economic factors that shape the experiences of Latinos with disabilities, their families, and service providers in the US and North America. Before we proceed, I'd like to point out the closed captioning and translation functions available at the bottom of your screen for accessibility. I'll repeat that again. Before we proceed, I'd like to point out the closed captioning and translation functions available at the bottom of your screen for accessibility. Allow me to extend a special thank you to a few individuals without whom this event would have not been possible. For the past 3 years, James Garcia has been the driving force behind the seamless coordination of this event. His dedication and hard work have been instrumental in bringing us all together for this virtual gathering. James, thank you very much. And a big thank you to Michael and Alexis on my team for managing the back-end Zoom coordination. Their technical expertise ensures everything runs smoothly for the next 3 days, allowing us to focus on the content and connections. Now I'm honored to introduce Amanda Ventura-Denny, the Public Affairs Manager at Waymo. Waymo has been a premier sponsor for UCP and a champion for the disability community. Amanda, thank you for your continued support and for being here. Amanda, I pass it over to you, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Armando, and good morning, everyone. We are so grateful here at Waymo to have the years of partnership that we've had with UCP, as well as the ability to come back again and sponsor the Conference on Latinos with Disabilities. This public forum is so incredibly important. It spotlights the role, impact, and influence of Latinos in the disability community. While many of the topics addressed will be of interest to the general disability community, we really think that the conference highlights the distinct ways, as Armando said, culturally, socially, economically, and then, of course, historically, that Latinos with disabilities and their families and their service providers, shape our society and communities at large. It's something that's also significant to the company and the employees that I represent at Waymo, where we're building a ride-hailing service with the goal of getting people where they need to go safely, efficiently, and I think most importantly, with dignity. Over the years, we've met numerous affiliate members of UCP and individuals who have cerebral palsy and many other cognitive or physical disabilities in areas where we operate, which currently are Phoenix, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and in the future, Austin. And we're so fortunate that the UCP community has joined us along this journey to build a transportation service that will not just save lives, but improve mobility access and increase independence for millions of people who cannot drive due to disability or do not feel safe using traditional mobility options. It's why we return every year as sponsors, because just as you are, I'm eager to learn from the guests and the incredible schedule of speakers over the next 3 days. Now I'm going to pass it along to this year's conference coordinator, James Garcia, who will open today's session with a presentation titled The State of Latinos with Disabilities. James, take it away.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Really appreciate it. And thanks again to Waymo, of course, for all of your support. It would be literally impossible for this to happen if it wasn't for your support and our other sponsors. So thank you very, very much. Okay, I'm going to see if I can do the technical thing here that needs to get done and open up my presentation. Okay, looks like it's there. All right. So far, so good. See if I can make it full screen here. Oops, the wrong button. This is the right button. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that. All right, I want to thank you all for being here. My name is James Garcia. I'm the communications coordinator for United Cerebral Palsy. It's my usual duties, but I'm also the creator in partnership with our entire team of this event. And as Armando mentioned, this is our 3rd year for the event. What I will be doing is I'm going to open up with kind of a general overview of the Latino community, our impact on the economy, culturally, and then more specifically with regards to Latinos with disabilities. And so it'll be kind of a broad panorama of that. And then we will go to, we'll be joined by 3 speakers, George Garcia, Robert Espinoza, and Grace Huerta, who I will introduce after I get done with this presentation and take this off the screen. So let me begin by just mentioning that if you want to at some point get a copy of this presentation, you're welcome to email me at the email address listed here at the bottom of the screen, if you can see that. And then it's also on the emails that go out for the event, right? Invite for this event. Also, quick housekeeping note, we will, of course, be doing this again tomorrow and Thursday at the same times from 1 p.m. Eastern until 4 p.m. Eastern each day. And if you signed up through Eventbrite, you do need to be registered, but that is the same link that you will use throughout the conference. So let's go. Let's begin now. So overall, let me see if I can minimize one of my screens here. There we go. Overall, in the United States, the Hispanic population reached 65 million in 2023. This is according to the US Census. That's up from 50 million in 2010, so a pretty big jump. And perhaps just as significantly, the population growth accounted for 71% of the nation's population growth between 2022 and 2023. This is as compared to overall population. So as you can see, we are a substantial segment of the population already and growing. We are actually growing at a faster rate than any other ethnic group in the country, with the exception of the Asian American population. The AAPI population grew at about 34% during the similar period. Now, in 2023, Hispanics made up nearly 1 in 5 people in the US, 19.5%, which is up from 16% in 2022 and just 5% in 1990. The population trends. Half of the population growth in the US over the past decade has been Latinos. So we've had this rapid growth rate going on for quite some time. The number of Latino workers in the labor force has grown from about 10 million people, almost 11 million people in 1990, to 30 million people in 2020, and it's projected to reach 35.9 million in 2023, according to the Department of Labor. This is relevant, of course, because in addition to being just a significant part of the overall population and the workforce, this, of course, always raises, this will raise the logical question of how we're impacting the workforce in the disability community. And I present these numbers, again, kind of in that broad context as well. Top 10 states with the most Hispanics. This is by percentage. So the number at the top, for instance, New Mexico, which has nearly half of its population is of Latino origin. That does not reflect specifically the number of people. California has the single largest Latino population in the country, but is by percentage number 2 on this list, then Texas, Arizona, and you can see the rest. So we are a significant portion of the population in these states across the country. But frankly, you can find Latinos these days in substantial numbers in every state in the country, from Iowa to Georgia or Florida, et cetera, et cetera. So we're now enmeshed across the country in every state. Top 11 cities with the most Hispanics. These are by population. So New York, which has a very diverse Puerto Rican, Dominican, the Central American, and now growing Mexican and Mexican-American population as well, has 2.7 million. Los Angeles at 1.8, Houston at 900,000, almost a million. And then we go from there. So you can see Phoenix, where I live, is about 643,000 Latinos in the state. We'll have no racial or ethnic majority by 2055. Why is this relevant? It's relevant because it speaks to some of the issues that are going to be brought up later in the presentation in terms of questions of cultural competency and an understanding of the community that's being served. If in the country at some point relatively soon, there's going to be a majority of the people in the country who are non-white, then that speaks to sort of the expectation about the kind of services that they're going to be provided. Who are the healthcare workers? What are the needs of that particular population? The vast and overwhelming majority, of course, Latinos in the U.S. are U.S. born and citizens, but there is a substantial percentage that are non-citizens, and that's a population that's being replenished pretty perennially. And so you may get into language barriers, other cultural barriers, cultural mores, political backgrounds, that sort of thing. So when it comes to the question of cultural competency, we're talking about just understanding the population that's being served, and not just the population that's being served if you're someone with a disability in the disability community, but also who is serving you, who is actually providing care for you. Some recent numbers suggest that the caregiving core population is increasingly immigrant, something close to about a third, more than 27% of caregivers across the board are immigrants. Not all of those, of course, are Latino immigrants, but a substantial number are, particularly in the Southwestern areas where Latinos predominate. I post this because the source of the next couple of slides is the Latino Donor Collaborative. This is a relatively new organization that's primarily business-oriented and targeting or focused on the economy, but they have some really interesting numbers that kind of speak to, again, the impact of the Latino population on the U.S. The 2023 LDC report, Latino Donor Collaborative report, which came out in September, shows that the Latino GDP, the gross domestic product of the Latino community, is at $3.2 trillion and growing at 2.5 times faster than the non-Latino equivalent. And so kind of in plain English, this sort of refers back to our population growth rate, the impact we're having on the labor market, how fast we're growing there. So that growth in our Latino GDP, which was just 14% just year over year in this last report that they presented, is really pretty tremendous and having a tremendous impact. And then, in fact, by comparison, if it was a standalone economy, it would be the 5th largest economy in the world, ahead of India, the United Kingdom, and France, which, of course, are all developed nations in their own right. Let's go more specifically here to adults with disabilities in the U.S. Adults with disabilities by ethnicity and race. This chart comes from the Centers for Disease Control. And as you can see, it has the array of where the population breaks down and what percentage approximately of that population are people with disabilities. The overall number is 1 in 4 Americans in the country, rather American adults in the country have a disability. And you can see across the board there, those numbers for the specific ethnic groups. In the Hispanic community, it's 1 in 6, and in the Asian community, it's 1 in 10. What accounts for this disparity? American Indians have a proportionally higher rate of disability, as does the Black community. What accounts for this? It's primarily, but not exclusively, the age of the population on average, which we'll get to here. Nearly 6 in 10 Hispanics are millennial or younger. So this is a tremendous portion of the Hispanic population, and something like a little more than, I think, a third are actually under 18 or younger than 18. So what that means, in sort of, again, kind of simple terms, is that as a population, Latinos are younger, and therefore on average healthier, because young people tend to be healthy, of course. But there are some other factors to consider when we talk about the question of disabilities or healthcare or health status in the Latino community overall. And that's what this speaks to. Oh, I'm sorry, well, let me go to the math here. How many Latinos have disability? I showed you the numbers overall in terms of our population earlier. Now here's the math. So the CDC speaks to 1 in 6 US Latinos having a disability as compared to 1 in 4 overall. If you do the math, 73% of US Latinos are adults. So we're talking about the adult population within the community. 65 million Latinos currently, according to the census, times 73% is 47.5 million adults. You divide that by 6, the 1 in 6, and you have nearly 8 million people in the country who are adults and Latino with disabilities. I'm sorry for all the math there, but I wanted to make sure that you could just sort of see how we get to this estimate of 8 million. And I should note this is probably a somewhat soft estimate, in part because somewhere in the range of about a third of the US Latino population is foreign-born, though the overwhelming majority of those are people who have either been naturalized or have permanent residency or some other legal means for remaining and being a part of our society. A relatively small percentage is actually undocumented. But when you do get into particularly the undocumented population, and when you get into younger populations, it gets difficult sometimes to calculate who has a disability or doesn't. There was a recent study that was reported, I think, by the New York Times, which talked about a kind of skyrocketing rate of autism among Blacks and Latinos. Why was that? Well, it's not because there's something necessarily specific happening to those communities that is making more of them have to live with autism. It's the fact that they are finally being studied and counted. Somebody is actually taking the time now to take a look at the population and ask the questions that would determine a much more accurate reading or documentation of that condition in that community. So that's just one example of how sometimes within low-income communities, and a substantial part of our population is still low income, a younger population, and a population that may have substantial number of immigrants, it can be more difficult to sort of pinpoint. So this estimate of 8 million Latinos in the US who are adults who have a disability is probably a soft number. The number is probably higher than that. The Hispanic health paradox. This kind of alludes to what I mentioned earlier in terms of what experts in the field speak to as a kind of paradox when it comes to the state of the community's health. Again, Latinos tend to be younger on average than non-Hispanic whites nationwide. The median age, half or above, half below, versus the non-Latino population is 27 versus 41. So the median age for Latinos is 27 years old, and for non-Hispanic whites, it's 41 years of age. And of course, our health conditions are going to be vastly different at 27 versus 41. So this is partly what accounts for the on average kind of healthier, if you will, state of Latinos. And yet a couple of factors that have to be discussed here that are really pertinent to the overall health status of a community involves health insurance and access to health insurance. So Latinos are less likely than non-Latinos to have health insurance, substantially less likely. And if you look at the Native American population, it's even less so there. Latinos are also less likely, thus, to have a primary care physician so that they can address preventive kind of healthcare measures, which we always advise everyone to do, and I try to do as much as possible because I do have a primary healthcare physician, and I'm fortunate, and I do have health insurance. And then there's also the question of access to state-of-art care facilities. State-of-art care facilities could be anything from, is there a hospital nearby, an emergency room nearby, to clinics, to the numbers of doctors' offices. People have probably heard about kind of food scarcity and food deserts in low-income communities. Well, that same phenomenon applies to access to healthcare and the number of doctors who may be nearby, so that if you do get sick or you do want to have a doctor, then you're able to access that readily as opposed to having to travel some great distance. And then, of course, there's income, right? The income that you earn is going to have a lot to do with whether or not, first of all, that you have health insurance. Secondly, whether you can afford co-pays, the medications that are prescribed, et cetera, et cetera. So while the population on whole, because of its relative youth, is healthier, because so many of us are so young, you saw earlier, a quarter of the population, or I'm sorry, a third of the population is under 18 years old. At the same time, when we do get sick, that doesn't mean we always have access to the kind of care that we need. One example of this kind of lack of access to adequate healthcare services and related resources involves the pandemic that we all just lived through. And of course, many people did not survive. And by one example, according to the CDC, while the population at that time accounted for under 19% of the US population, about 25% of all COVID-19 cases were Latino. So we had a higher incidence of exposure to COVID, and mortality rates, depending on the cities you were in, the communities you were in, were sometimes 2 to 3 times higher than for non-Hispanics. So that, again, is kind of an example, perfect example, if you will, of you get sick, do you have access to a doctor? Can you, get treatment? Can you get to a hospital in time, et cetera, et cetera? Are you able to even get the vaccine? Early on in the process, there were a lot of problems with the distribution of vaccines and big problems with the distribution and accessibility of vaccines in communities of color. I live in Arizona, and the Navajo reservation at one point had the single highest rate of COVID in the world. It was really astounding to know that here in the United States that was the case. But that was the case. It was relatively briefly, but it, of course, did have much higher rates overall than the non-Native American population. So this is just one example of how the lack of access to adequate healthcare services can impact the overall state of health for a community. There's something that I've seen referred to in the past as kind of a triple burden for people with disabilities. I kind of prefer the term challenge, but so I speak about the quadruple challenge for some U.S. Latinos, not all, because those of us probably presenting today who are of Latino origin probably live and work kind of in the middle class, and so have access to healthcare and health insurance, but a substantial portion of our population does not. And so these 4 factors sometimes fall on a population all at once, depending where you are in the community. So you could be someone with a disability, cerebral palsy, autism, Down syndrome, whatever the case may be. You could also be facing instances of institutionalized racism when you go and try to receive care. It is well documented, for instance, that African Americans receive much better care on average from African American doctors. And that's so that when they're not seeing African American doctors, the kind of impacts of institutionalized racism or bigotry or so forth will impact their ability to get good care. Lower economic status, always. If you're poor, whether you're white, Black, Latino, Native American, Asian American, whatever the case may be, if you don't have enough money beyond your ability to survive week to week and get your rent paid and put groceries on the table, if you don't have enough money to pay for health care, you have to deal with that as well. And then there is that smaller but substantial segment of the population who are impacted by their immigration status, because people who are immigrants may come from countries and regions of the world where they're not as trusting of the healthcare industry or major governmental institutions, or they may be here undocumented. And although those who come here undocumented are overwhelmingly very young, most of the people are men, most of them are young and very healthy, and they've come here to work. That being the case, if you work in an industry, for instance, construction or something along those lines, or if you're in the essential work status and you're a farm worker, the rate of injury in those jobs is tremendously high. And so that you could be injured and then find yourself having to live with a disability. And if you happen to kind of fall into all of these categories at once, disability, maybe you're facing racial barriers, low income, and immigration status, that makes it, if you're undocumented, impossible for you to obtain, for instance, Medicaid or state-financed health insurance, then you're really in trouble. And so there is a segment of our population, and not insignificant segment of our population, that deals with this quadruple challenge. Caregivers, this will be talked about a little bit more, I think, by one of our guests for today's panel, healthcare and so forth. But caregivers, we should also keep in mind, as I mentioned earlier, that as the demographics of the country changes, that means two things, of course. The people who need care, their demographics are changing. They're becoming increasingly Latino. And those who care for people with disabilities, that demographic is also changing, though it probably isn't changing as fast as the population itself. In other words, who's providing the care? There's going to be a substantial lag, perhaps, in terms of the ethnic makeup or racial makeup of the people providing care versus those who are needing care. So this just speaks again to the need for culturally competent caregivers, training, and awareness about it, and understanding that there needs to be culturally competent care given to populations so that we're tuned in on things like language needs or other cultural needs and understandings that a particular population may have. We spoke earlier about the role of immigration. The only thing I'll mention additionally here, and this is also going to be the topic of a panel discussion that we'll have later in the conference, is that in addition to immigration status, all of the attention that's been given in recent news media accounts, particularly in recent years, about the surge of refugees and people who are seeking asylum in the United States. While most of the folks who are physically able to make it to our border and cross and seek asylum are going to be relatively healthy, there are people who are refugees, who are asylum seekers, who have disabilities. And they're showing up on our doorstep, and they need help. And sometimes those disabilities are quite severe, because sometimes parents, for instance, bring their children and then they discover that maybe their child is dealing with a disability they weren't even aware of. So this is a factor in that conversation, and we'll be addressing this later in the conference. And then we'll close with, on a somewhat lighter note, if you will, famous Latinos with disabilities. Actress and producer Salma Hayek lives with dyslexia, has dealt with it all of her life. Frida Kahlo, famous painter from Mexico, had multiple injuries, including polio, as well as a physical accident that caused her physical disability and mobility issues. Fans of the show Born This Way may know Cristina Sainz, who became the first Hispanic woman with a disability as part of an ensemble cast to win an Emmy Award. And Demi Lovato, the singer, actress, is bipolar, singer, actor, director, Selena Gomez. She does everything under the sun. Lives with lupus, and also had, I believe, a kidney transplant. I'm not certain about that, but I know she had a transplant. So these are just some of the people, obviously, that sort of we know and see every day in terms of on our TV screens or film or in movies, who may or may not be aware live with a disability. And then myself, I'm not famous, but I do live with clinical depression, one of the so-called invisible disabilities. And speaking of mental illness, 35% of Latino adults with mental illness receive treatment each year, as compared to the average American receiving 46.2% of that population receiving treatment or having access to treatment. Overall, our ability to treat people with mental illness in the country is still very woefully lacking. But you can see here that even just within that category, there is a disparity. And again, much of this has to do with being able to be diagnosed, having access to a facility, having access to a therapist or a psychiatrist or someone who can provide you the help. And certain people, a certain segment of our population does not have that access. That ends my presentation. I'm going to log out, get this off of my screen here. Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, yeah.
Wait, I'm sorry. I thought it had locked me off completely. I apologize. Okay, so let me try to find my. Okay, so we're going to go now to our discussion portion of this event. I want to introduce my guest here today. Let's see, did I stop sharing? Can you tell, Michael, if I stopped?
You're still sharing.
Oh, I'm still sharing. Okay, well, there we go. Okay, fine. Sorry about that. Okay, so we're going to go to our discussion portion now. And I want to introduce my guests in sequence here. First, I'll begin with Grace Huerta. Grace Huerta is a vice president at El ARC in California, which is part, of course, of the national organization, the ARC, which does tremendous work around the country, addressing issues with the community with disabilities. And it's been around quite some time. And so Grace is in charge of and a key player in an organization that is addressing the needs of people with disabilities in California. Grace, feel free to turn your camera on whenever you're ready. And then we also have George Garcia, who's with the Southwest Institute of Families based in Phoenix, Arizona, a longtime leader in the community on these issues. And then finally, Robert Espinoza. Robert Espinoza is with the National Coalition. Oh, I'm sorry, I've lost my screen here for your title. I'm sorry, please give me your title, Robert. I lost my screen here.
Sure, I'm the CEO.
CEO, okay.
Yep.
So we're going to start with what I'd like to do is have each person spend just like 2 minutes. Robert, you may have a presentation. Feel free to go a little longer if you have a more formal presentation, but have everybody at least introduce themselves and tell us your kind of your primary role with your organization. And then we'll go into a kind of a general discussion about some of the numbers I presented, any issues that you feel are relevant to raise at this time. So Grace, can we begin with you, please?
Sure. Are you hearing me okay? Testing,
Yes.
1, 2, 3. Okay, good. Thank you so much, James. Well, excellent presentation. You really inspired me as to why we do the work, and your presentation hit it right on target in terms of why we need that data, especially the focus of the Latinos, because it's such a huge population. It continues like your presentation stated we really need to continue the work, and I'm just grateful. I know UCP has a tremendous amount of partnership throughout the state with ARC of California. And also, I just wanted to quickly tell the attendees that I'm also a parent. I have two adults in the autism spectrum, and also a son-in-law. My daughter got married to someone in the spectrum, so I have a
Oh, wow.
son-in-law in the autism spectrum, and I'm also co-founder of Exceptional Family Center. We're located in Kern County, Bakersfield, California, and so I'm really grateful to be here for this discussion. And one of the things that Exceptional Family Center does is that it was created specifically, primarily, it was called Celebración de Familias about 12 years ago when we first started because of the need in our county. There was nothing for the Latinos in our community. And when I say Kern County, it's pretty huge geographical location. It's very large. And but also we about a year ago, ARC of California gave the Latinos an opportunity to form El ARC de California, which is statewide, and it's a very exciting time, very exciting moment for the Latinos, especially the leadership that exists, that has been doing the work really for a long time, but haven't had the collaborative support for all the leaders to come together to figure out what are the solutions that are going to finally bring change. So that in a capsule is the different hats that, like I know a lot of us wear when we switch these different hats to do the work that needs to be done for the Latinos and all people really in our community who have children or are adults with disabilities.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Grace. Just one really quick question. Has your organization, El ARC, been growing in terms of members?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. Well, actually, we did, ARC of California was able to get a grant specifically for the Latino community to form a coalition to identify who are these Latino leaders, both self-advocates, which is really huge for us. We really want to open the door to self-advocates. My children who are adults are eager to represent their needs, and also to break those perceptions that society has on adults, and of course the children too, especially adults who age out of high school. There's this tremendous amount of uncertainty. And many of us parents feel when they age out of high school, now what, where do they fit in, and why is it so difficult to transition into that adult world? So ARC of California is really helping families bridge who are these organizations, where are they, so that we can more easily connect with those organizations. And so about a year ago, there was a grant, and COVID kind of brought along that urgency. Like you said in your report, James, the COVID really, there was tremendous amount of people that were so much more isolated and disconnected and left without services for their children. So ALARC California was formed to do 4 Latino statewide conferences to come together, identify the leadership that exists throughout the state, leaders who are already doing the work, self-advocates who want to say, I want to step in. I keep hearing, we have a voice. How do I use that voice? Where do I go so that I can spread the message about our needs in our community, about the struggles that specifically that the Latinos are having, which like your presentation stated, James, there's a variety of reasons. I wish there was just one thing, right, to have equality and justice.
Never just one thing.
It would be so easy to say, okay, if you just fix this one thing, but no, it is it is a variety of things. But does it make it less possible? Absolutely not. And so that's why LR, with this wonderful funding that came along, we with that funding came along a facilitator to create a strategic action plan. And with that, we created the plan as to specify, because there could be a lot of talk, like in developing a conference. One of the goals the conferences have or summits have is what we really want to hone in to the solutions that will finally bring the outcomes and the results, so our community can have the services. And it's not just what the leadership learned throughout the state. We all came together, these 4 different counties throughout the state, what we learned in quite a few things, but just for this conference with this for today, is that the systemic things need to be. It's a variety of systemic and community, the rural areas, the fear and the families feel so intimidated sometimes with the complexities of the system. But then we also found out that within these summits, we invited the professionals. They're also very eager to say, "Hey, we want to do better." You know, it's not you against us. It's really a blend of how can we come together. The institutional racism, is it uncomfortable to talk about it? Sure. You know, many of our families and self-activists, we don't want to create enemies. We really want to create more of a partnership. We want to build bridges. How can we help this system that was created by families for families so that their children can have a productive, meaningful life, employment, or college, or whatever it is that is person-centered. You know, we always talk about person-centered to that individual. So with those 4 summits that were created, we really, really honed in into that strategic plan. And now that plan is active. One of the things we want to do is activate. You know, don't keep it. You don't want to keep it. It's like just like you, James. You don't want to just keep it for you, right? You want to say, how do I activate this? How do I put it into action? So not only to help the leadership, people who already are leaders, self-advocates who are already prepared. A lot of times we feel like, oh, they need to prepare. They don't have the skill set. No. Throughout the year, we have been preparing the leadership. But how do we put that, how do we activate them into their community so that they can flourish, they could thrive, and they could feel a sense of that not only that purpose, but accomplishment. Because if we don't have, even if it's small wins, we don't have the little small wins, you know, people start feeling like, wow, this is a lot of work. Yeah. We don't want to, the last thing we want is for you to feel that, are we really making a difference here? Are we making, because all we keep hearing is that now DDS has a master plan. Now, you know, these other committees are forming to help with disparity and equality and justice. And it seems like all these little think tanks are all over the place, right? And so
it's really about service ultimately, right? It's about being able to get services for whatever it is in your family.
Access
I
and
want to go to George now.
yes, go ahead. Thank you.
One thing I mentioned in passing just very quickly is that I hear what you're alluding to, and in part that it affects UCP affiliates, and we have several in California. It may be that you have an affiliate or an agency providing services that isn't necessarily identified as aimed at or doing substantial outreach to the Latino community, but people in their population area, might be substantially Latino. And I know a couple of our UCP affiliates, they work with a lot of Latinos in the community, although the institution may not necessarily be characterized as kind of a Hispanic-oriented one, right? So you've got the Hispanic groups or organizations on the ground, like the one you founded, doing direct work, and then you're often kind of indirectly partnering with existing agencies that may or may not have that history. So I think it's relevant. George, talk about your organization, Phoenix, your role there with your organization, and the nature of the population that you address.
Yeah, thank you guys for inviting me to this conference. My name is George Garcia, and I am Executive Director of Southwest Institute for Families and Children. We're a nonprofit organization here in Phoenix, Arizona, where we support people with disabilities through empowerment, advocacy, and knowledge. So I know those are very generic terms, but so what do we do? Well, we work primarily with people with with people with disabilities, but primarily those with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So we work both here in Arizona and nationally with our partners to create resources, support self-advocacy groups, support self-advocates in growing, both here in Arizona and nationally. We work with our partners here in Arizona to do voter education, to get people interested in voting, registering to vote, and knowing their rights as people with disabilities. their rights and responsibilities as people with disabilities. We work with vocational rehabilitation to help people with disabilities get signed up for any education or any training that they may need so that they are able to, use folk rehab services to get the training that they need or the education and eventually become employed. We also facilitate self-advocacy groups here in Arizona and also work with self-advocacy groups throughout the country to help them strengthen themselves, develop goals and objectives, and help recruit other self-advocates so that, we found that self-advocates learn about self-advocacy best from themselves.
Yeah.
When you have that conversation and say what's going on in your life and they can learn from each other, it's better than someone from the outside going, oh, well, this is what you need to do.
Yeah.
And so,
Are you,
that's WI.
Can you speak to just one question, then I'll go to introduce Roberto. But can you speak to the sort of the makeup of the population in the state or regionally? Because I asked that question in part because I know that it wasn't that long ago that you worked in conjunction with the Arizona Disability Law Center on a panel that was bilingual or in Spanish on voting issues. Is that correct? I'm trying to recall what the subject of that conference was. It was a couple of years ago.
Yeah. We like you said, we do work with Disability Rights Arizona, formerly known as Arizona Center for Disability Law, and I do believe you're going to have Ronaldo Fowler as one of your panelists.
The next panel.
There you go. And so he's the person that we primarily work with to do voter education. Population wise, we try to do outreach throughout the state. We do education both in English and in Spanish. We've worked with parent groups here in Arizona that are Latino-led organizations. We've worked with the Navajo population up in northern Arizona to do voter education up there. So it is a very wide spectrum as to who we are targeting or who we're reaching out to. But unfortunately, a lot of times the Latino population doesn't really seek out services, do not really try to get involved as much as other non-Hispanic populations. So it's been a real struggle to try and get, to do outreach to these populations. And even if we do outreach, it's often to parents of children with disabilities or Latino children with disabilities, which is great. If we can reach them that way, all the better. But we really want to see an increase of self-advocates with, Latinos who are self-advocates as opposed to just parents.
And all of those points,
That's
of course, all of those points, of course, allude to some of the things I mentioned in the presentation with regards to it could be immigration status, it could be income status. Maybe some of the lower incomes are not used to engaging kind of in mainstream activities or institutions, et cetera, et cetera. So those challenges arrive. Robert, if you wouldn't mind, please talk about your organization. And I know that you have a long background in sort of data gathering and analysis about who's out there providing services. But speak to those issues in your background and how it impacts on the conversation we're having.
Yes, absolutely. Hi, everybody. Thank you, James, for the presentation. Thank you, Grace and George and Armando. Congratulations on this event. My name is Robert Espinoza, and I'm the CEO of National Skills Coalition. We're a national bipartisan policy organization that focuses on improving skills training and other kinds of workforce development supports for workers, specifically in jobs that do not require a bachelor's degree. So most jobs in this country, and a large percentage of which are occupied by Latino people. Prior to NSC, I was the head of the think tank side of PHI, which is an organization that focuses on improving jobs for home care workers and nursing assistants who support millions of older adults and people with disabilities in a wide range of settings. I'm really impressed by this conversation, and I'm glad that we're drawing attention to this issue of Latinos with disabilities. And I think the lens that I would add on to it is the ways in which all of these issues interface with two other kind of dimensions, which is education and employment. James, when you presented the quadruple challenge, the category of institutionalized racism, I think, holds quite a few dimensions within it. And I think the work that we do at the National Skills Coalition zeroes in on the ways in which a history of systemic racism, specifically in education and employment, has really changed the extent to which Latino workers, Latino disabled workers can succeed, can save money, can retire, and so much more. A few stats and a few points that I want to add to this conversation in that context. We know, for example, that there are about 2.4 million working age Hispanic adults in the US that have at least one disability, and about more than 1 million have at least two or more disabilities. Many of the people with disabilities are younger, but simply because as for two reasons. One is that the latest data includes people living with long COVID. And so COVID created a whole range of disabilities among currently employed people, right? And so that tended to skew younger. And yet when you disaggregate when you control for that population, what you see is what you often see in the rest of the country, which is that disabilities often incur with age. And so you see higher disability rates among people in their 60s, their 70s and 80s. And as people live longer, thanks to medical advances, what you see are disability rates increasing, right? And yet for the last 10 years prior to National Skills Coalition, what we focused on was the reality that we didn't have the paid long-term care workforce to support people with disabilities in a wide range of settings. And so what we often saw were older people, people with disabilities, family caregivers who simply could not access a trained, well-paid home care worker or nursing assistant to support them in their setting of choice, because those workers weren't staying in those jobs. And the primary reason they weren't staying in those jobs is that they didn't pay enough, right? And so I think the dimension that I would add to this conversation is just one, the reality that in a country where access to employment and education has been racialized, and it has denied the same opportunities to Latino, to Black people, to Asian, Pacific Islander, Indigenous people, et cetera. And that has in turn led to different employment opportunities as well. What you see is just a very different reality, right? For Latino disabled people, right? You see the reality of weaker economic realities. You see constant discrimination, subtle and overt, and in job settings, in daily life, and so on. And you see just a different quality of life. At the same time as which we're relying on a caregiving sector that should be supporting all of us as we age and live with disabilities, and that workforce isn't there, again, because of that discrimination, right? 1 in 6 direct care workers is Hispanic or Latino. 65% of all direct care workers are people of color, and they have historically always been relegated to low-wage jobs in this country. So it's, again, another pattern of the ways in which we're all, I think, suffering from that long history of discrimination.
Mm-hmm. I'll mention sort of a passing plug for United Cerebral Palsy, an anchor partner on something called the Case for Inclusion report annually, which we've been doing for quite a number of years. And in that report, we try to highlight the fact that not only is there a workforce shortage in terms of disability support professionals and other caregivers that the country is facing for a lot of economic reasons and historical reasons, but we speak to, again, the reality that you just noted, the people who are providing the care, something like 80% women, 2/3 people of color, a substantial portion that you just described are Latino, and that segment is probably increasing. Also, you alluded, of course, to age and disability. Has been pointed out to me more than once. We're all at some point in the course of our lives are going to be disabled if we live long enough. And that reality is starting to impinge even more so on the Latino population, a kind of interesting twist on what I mentioned earlier about, on average, we're younger. Our median age is younger as a population as compared to non-Hispanic whites. But our aged population, our elderly population, is growing now proportionally. And so that means that our community is facing the same communities that all populations in the country are facing. And this is an aging country. This is a country that is aging overall, which is, in my opinion, why so many immigrants show up on our doorstep, because the jobs are here and they know they're here. And that's why they come. A little tidbit, as a couple of you probably know, AARP has made a big push in recent years to do a lot of outreach to the Latino community, because they measure this stuff on an ongoing basis and know that we're an increasing part of that population. But as you spoke to, that's about reaching a point where you may be dealing with disabilities that you didn't have, obviously, as a younger age. Let's talk about solutions. You had mentioned, Grace, solutions, right? In terms of the conversation that we're having about who we are, which to me is about awareness. I mean, the whole function of this conference isn't so much, although we've done some kind of workshop training, if you will, or seminar stuff in our conference before, it isn't quite so much about here's a specific set of skills that you can show up and take with you. But it is certainly about awareness. It's certainly about letting our community know, the people who are signed on watching today, and the country as a whole know that our population is here. We're a substantial part of the disability community, and they should be reaching out so that we can get those services as well. But speak to that, if you could, in terms of solutions.
One of the solutions we brought at the annual performance contract meetings at our local Kern Regional Center was that the Latinos parents, and like George said, we really want to push self-advocates. They deserve to be there on the table, is formed the Padres Unidos del Condado de Kern. And the mission of that parent group and for self-advocates is for the Spanish-speaking and bilingual speaking parents to have a monthly meeting at the regional center. Why was that presented to Kern Regional Center? Because of the disconnect that existed. It was, they saw the regional center more like a silo, operating in its own systemic way and doing what they're supposed to be mandated to do without the input of the self-advocates and the very people that they're talking about, the Latinos. Why this decade long of access to services, the disparity reports year after year saying that this much has been spent to this segment of the population, Anglo, but this much has been spent to the Latinos, where there's, like your data shows, the Latinos are this much. It should be reversed. You should be spending more for the Latinos because the population is that much larger, but that's another discussion for another time. But
it's this discussion at the same time, isn't it? Yeah.
So one of the solutions we came is that we want to be in that talks. We want to be in that, what they call plan of action for disparity. Kern Regional Center is mandated to submit a report to the Department of Developmental Services, what we call DDS, to submit a report of what is their plan of action. What are you going to do about the disparity of services, what they call inequality? And that difficult conversation Robert also mentioned, institutional racism, the biases that we all have. I mean, a white family comes into my office and they're a stronger skill set. They're about boom, boom, boom. This is what we need, boom. And they don't take yes or no for an answer, but they have that confidence. And like, we said in a report, many of our families come from rural areas. They don't have the knowledge. So anyway, long story short, I will make it short, is that the Padres Unidos are meeting monthly with the regional center to say, this is what we feel needs to be done. Not just, here's your data, and you're presenting us the data, your plan of action. How is it going to be conducted? How are the outcomes going to be measured? And that's part of what here at Exceptional Family Center we're doing as well with the Padres Unidos group and all our parents, is that what are the questions that we should be asking? We feel like we know what we should be asking, but how do we ask it? Like they say they're doing this. Okay, so now what we're going to ask is how are they going to measure it? ¿Cómo se va a medir? What are the outcomes that you're supposed to be submitting, and when is that going to be reported publicly to us? Because we're your community, we're your families, or the self-advocates are here, want to know, so that was one solution. And then here, of course, at our center, we're a part of the local family resource center. We're asking the regional center to please bridge these families to the FRCs, family resource centers. We conduct monthly parent trainings. We have self-advocates here. And then in our state of California, we have what they call, I think James probably knows, this self-determination. Self-determination is a whole new program where the Anglos, English speaking, are accessing a lot more rate than the Spanish speaking, because it requires knowing how to work the self-determination program base. It does require a skill set, a knowledge. So that is something that we're doing here monthly at the regional, we're actually weekly, sometimes more than weekly. And we're letting the parents, the self-advocates, to choose. You tell us what is it that you need? What are we not doing? You are the community we serve. You are the parents and self-advocates. You belong first and forefront, in the front, and preparing them how to do that.
Two things come to mind, and George, I'd like you to address this. One is among all of the layers of complexity on some level, things that are impacting the ability to access services, right? Some of that involves our current electoral system and our participation rates as voters, and whether they see us at the legislature asking to testify, or if we have lobbyists for our community speaking on our behalf, or the number of representatives in state government who happen to be Latino or not Latino. I know that those numbers have been increasing pretty substantially in Arizona, for instance, in the last decade or decade and a half, in part as a reaction to some really stringent immigration legislation that was passed in 2010. And so I see a lot of young Latinos now who are state representatives and state senators. But then in addition to having those faces and those people at the legislature proposing laws, we of course have to prove that we have an impact overall on the outcome of elections. And so that means we have to turn out to vote. And self-advocacy is in its own way, of course, an aspect of that. George, you've worked in sort of that area with regards to voter outreach overall, but we're Latinos. I think I saw a number recently in Arizona that said there would be 855,000 Latinos in Arizona who were eligible to vote in this upcoming election. But we have had we often have had traditionally lower voter turnout for a number of reasons, including the fact that many of us are very, very young, and young people tend not to vote as much as older people. But talk about the work you're doing in that aspect and how that ties into this conversation. We want solutions, but we also need to have representation when it comes to regulations and laws.
Well, I mean, voting is a very powerful tool. But one of the things about disabilities is that regardless of whether you're white or Latino or whatever, the fact of the matter is that most elected officials are not aware of disability issues in general. And that's a big issue. If you speak with representatives, or even if you go on their websites, oftentimes they may not even have a platform addressing disability issues. And so one of the things that we talk to all our people that we work with to educate them on voting rights is we also talk about advocacy and being able to talk to your representatives. We do education on how to reach out to both state and federal elected officials, how to let them know about the issues that are important to us. There is a huge movement or campaign to educate our legislators on what are the disability issues that are affecting us right now, whether it's in their employment or some of the attacks that are going on the Americans with Disabilities Act, as they actively work to lessen its strength. So, we really try to educate the people that we're working with, not just on, Latino issues, but, also on what are the issues that are affecting you, so that, politicians are aware of us and realize that, we're also just as important as some of the other campaign issues that they're dealing with.
There's sometimes a kind of sort of detrimental relationship between questions of the invisibility of the disability community, right? Because I think we can acknowledge that that's always broadly an issue, right? Whether we're visible, whether people with disabilities are included, et cetera, et cetera. But there's also been a trend in recent years of increasingly repressive and stringent voting regulations. And those stringent voting regulations are having a fallout that is impacting people with disabilities, no matter your racial background.
Oh,
right? Yeah.
Some of the, sorry for interrupting, but
Oh, no.
you're absolutely right. I mean, the results of, past elections and people, whether they believed it was a fair and accurate election. There's been a subsequent trying to pass all these laws that they say will make, voting safer, right? So they'll say, we got to get rid of mail-in ballots. We got to get rid of early voting. We got to get rid of just all sorts of laws that will have a huge detrimental effect on people with disabilities. A lot of people with disabilities are not able to go to polling stations. Mail-in balloting is the only way that they're able to vote. Being able to go in person is going to be much more difficult for some people. And so these laws are going to have a huge impact on people with disabilities and their ability to participate in the voting section. And in some states,
hundreds of bills have been passed across the country.
Go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. Literally hundreds of bills across the country have been passed along those lines.
Oh yeah. And it has, I think, a bigger impact on the disability community than any other community. Just because, we really want to increase the ability for people to vote and giving them all sorts of access to the ballot. I think Arizona has a great relationship with our Secretary of State as far as people with disabilities. They've been very receptive onto, how to increase the ability for people to vote. Our Maricopa County Recorder is also very open to helping people with disabilities, ensuring that they understand their rights to vote. And I think we're very fortunate in Arizona to have that relationship with our elected officials. Not a lot of states can say that.
Yeah. In fact, our next panel today will be dealing specifically with voting and accessibility. Robert, let's go back to the topic of kind of solutions in terms of your experience and the work you've done. What are some of the solutions to those issues that you've already raised and we've raised today?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would underscore Grace's comments about I work in the realm of policy change of what governments can do at the state, local, and federal level. And I think certainly policy can play a big part in funding and incentivizing the kinds of services that Grace spoke about and repairing our voting system, right, our democracy in so many ways, as George mentioned. In the context of Latinos with disabilities who are workers, I mean, I think there are a number of issues that I would highlight. One is that I still think policy needs to play a stronger role in making sure that we enhance workplace accommodations, including telework and paid leave, right? These have been shown to be incredibly important through the COVID-19 pandemic, and they continue to be important for people with disabilities. I still believe discrimination happens on multiple levels against both Latino people and people with disabilities, and obviously those of us who live at the intersection. So we need a stronger enforcement of those laws. We do have an unfortunate section of the Fair Labor Standards Act that allows employers to pay workers with disabilities less than the federal minimum minimum wage, and it needs to be eliminated. It's a provision that's grossly unfair. And we need to raise asset limits for things like Social Security insurance and other programs. And then I mentioned earlier the importance of direct care workers for so many older people and people with disabilities, many of whom are Latino. And in that context, we need policies that improve wages and compensation for workers, a better financing of long-term services and supports, which provides both the care and the job quality improvements that we need. We need improvements in skills training and advancement and opportunities for better careers. And we need better supports that are equity and culturally and linguistically competent, right? How do we ensure that workers who are not proficient in English or who learn differently, right, have access to training and educational resources that abide by their cultural and linguistic needs, by their learning abilities and their differences in that regard. And I would say, I just want to build on the conversation that was happening between George and James about invisible or hypervisible, right? I remember hearing years ago a conversation, a quote, and I'm paraphrasing here, by kind of a critical race scholar who said that the thing with inequality is that people are either invisible or they're hypervisible, and there's no in between, right? And so when you think about immigrants as one example, right, they are the invisible, quote unquote, invisible workforce in our country in the gray market, and yet there's hardly any issue in this country that is as salient or as charged as immigrations, especially immigrants at the border, right? The same can be said about transgender issues. The same can be said about disability issues, right? And that's how inequality operates, that you're not seen or you're seen in ways that are really distorted to the truth, right? And I think the challenges we have in front of us as a country is, how do you bring the issues all the way to the middle, right? To the everyday people, so that we don't just see them once or twice in ways that are not representative of the majority of us, but actually in ways that really convey the richness of who we are.
I think we lost James.
We might have lost James, yes.
Okay, let us take over. No, I like what you said, Robert, though, because you're right. How do we get this in the middle? I think that statement you just made is very powerful. And when we talk about the solutions, because that's what we all need. We're all doing the important work in our communities and areas. And part of that solution. Yeah, he returned. We're
I'm so
covering
sorry.
we're covering
But go ahead. I'm sorry. I apologize.
No, I think
I was
Robert was just finishing up his statement, James.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, thank you, Robert. I will try to stay online here. I just dropped my line for some reason. Anyway, so I do want to, if we can start to wrap up, we'll be ending this session at 11:25. But maybe any closing comments, really, from any of you about, particularly maybe some of the big picture topics that were raised by the presentation. Something that you think is particularly important to share with regards to our audiences. Is there anything that's in mind?
I did want to add a little bit to that solutions conversation.
Please do.
One of the things that has recently passed in Arizona, and it's a growing thing across the United States, is something called supported decision making. Supported decision making is this idea that, well, in a nutshell, it's a less restrictive alternative to guardianship. When we were working with Disability Rights Arizona and the ARC of Arizona to teach supported decision making, one of the things that we did is we went ahead and interviewed families with disabilities or children with disabilities. And one of the focus groups that we did have was with Latino families. And oftentimes they were under the belief that they had to get guardianship of their children because the state might take them away. If they didn't have guardianship, they had to be very protective of their children. And what supported decision making says is, people with disabilities, I mean, yes, there are some people that will need guardianship in their lives, and that's, perfectly understandable, but not everybody needs guardianship, not to the extent that it's being used now. And so what we work with families is to teach them to say, or work with them to help their children gain the skills that they need to be able to make decisions for themselves as they transition into adulthood, especially. Um, Getting them involved in their own healthcare, getting them involved in all aspects of their lives, whether it's education or maybe future employment goals, and help them to, create a support network around them so that they can have someone that they can rely on to make their own decisions, to assist them in making their own decisions. This is oftentimes, Latino families, we're great in being close to our families, having the support of our families, but it could come to the detriment of being a little too overprotective of young adults with disabilities, and not involving them in their care, and making decisions for themselves. So what we do is with supported decision making is we say, support your children, help them make their own decisions, develop support networks around them so that you don't have to rely on guardianship, so that they're not totally dependent on you making decisions for themselves. And overall, it's going to increase their independence. It's going to increase their health outcomes because they're not going to rely on somebody else. And so we're really been pushing supported decision making here in Arizona.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, all very logical. Robert, any kind of maybe closing thoughts here on today's?
Yeah, absolutely. And I love the idea of supported decision making. I'll build on George's comment earlier about how so many policymakers today probably do not have a disability-based platform. And what does that mean in a country where most, if not all of us, will incur disability at some point in our lives? The lesson I would draw here really quickly is that I think there's a lesson that can be drawn from the LGBTQ rights movement of the 80s and 90s, of the political act of coming out, right? The more people came out as lesbian, as gay, as transgender, the less it became possible for people to ignore us, right? And the more that you started to see the country really wrestle with what sexual orientation and gender identity meant for this country, and you began seeing, yes, a number of hostile bills and laws and policies, and you saw a lot of progress as well, right? And I think about that with disability as well, right? The more that those of us who come out, especially if it's an invisible disability, so to speak, the more I think it can become commonplace, and the more we demand the kinds of policy recommendations that we can see. The same with caregiving. I mean, the more that people come out as having a caregiving issue in their life, and many of us are caregivers or are being cared by somebody, the less it becomes possible to ignore us. So I would just say, come out, come out, come out.
Well, I think it speaks to the visibility thing again, right? I mean, it speaks to that. And I think we still have enough of a stigma that sometimes people living with disabilities, maybe even people who have clinical depression, as I do, don't talk about it publicly, don't assert themselves politically, socially, etc. And so, haven't come out, if you will. And I think it goes across the spectrum in terms of a lot of different disabilities. And then I suppose finally, it should be kind of unconscionable that if 1 in 4 adults has a disability in the country, some form of disability, that every legislator doesn't have something on their platform that sort of speaks to the community's issues. So with that, let's close if we can. I want to thank our guest, Grace Huerta, who is with the Vice President of El ARC de California, George Garcia, Executive Director of the Southwest Institute for Families and Children, and Robert Espinoza, CEO of National Skills Coalition. I want to thank you all for being part of today's discussion. We're going to go to a short break now, about a 10-minute break, and then come back at 2:35 Eastern Time if you're in the East Coast. And we'll have our next panel discussion, which is voting accessibility and the disability community. Thanks so much for being on, everyone. It's really been an honor.
Thank you, everybody.